Hello everybody. Welcome back to another episode of NebuloCity. My name is Chris Pearson and I'm an amateur astrophotographer based here in the Washington, D.C. region. For those of you who are new to my channel, this channel is all about demonstrating what's possible in a very heavily light polluted sky. In particular, city skies, urban skies, where when you look up at the night sky, you can sort of count on one hand how many stars you can see. And that's very much the case in my neighborhood. So taking things like digital cameras, wide angle lenses, as well as dedicated astro cameras and small refractor telescopes like my Red Cat 51 is really what this channel is all about, and showing what's possible. So that's a very important theme for me, and I'm very proud and happy to be part of this wonderful community and be able to participate even though I'm in these light polluted skies. And in doing so, I'm going to be shooting a couple of different what I call twin objects in the night sky here in the summer in the northern latitudes. Those being the Eagle Nebula and Omega Nebula out there in the constellation Sagittarius, in and around the Milky Way core region nearby. Very bright, beginner-friendly objects for anyone who's interested in this hobby, and a really famous object in the Eagle Nebula. We won't be zooming in on it, but that object was made famous by the Hubble Space Telescope back in the 90s with its massive pillars of creation shot, these huge columns of gas and dust that are part of a star-forming region. Beyond that, another twin set of objects up in the constellation Cygnus, where we'll be pointing our telescope northward. On this particular set of objects, the Sada region and the Crescent Nebula. Now these are very famous. William Herschel, the famed astronomer, back in 1792 discovered the Crescent Nebula. It's very well documented, and it's just such a wonderful object, especially in a wide field setting. You can get the gas clouds of the Sada region and the Crescent Nebula in one shot, and that's really the goal here. So I'm going to be shooting both, the first set of objects early in the evening, the Eagle Nebula and Omega, as well as the Cygnus region later in the evening into early morning hours. So some late days ahead, but very excited about it, happy to do it. But the second theme of this video, which perhaps is even more important, is a walkthrough of my workflow, the pre and post-process editing that I do for my photos. Now, a few of you have asked for me to go through this over the past 12 months, so I'm finally getting around to it. Apologies for the delay, but there's just been a lot of learning, and I wanted to feel confident that what I'm going to share is actually going to be helpful. So we're going to walk through the AstroPixelProcessor workflow with that particular program, but if you don't have AstroPixelProcessor, you could very easily bring in your stacked data from PixInsight or from Deep Sky Stacker. That's all fine. Beyond the stacking process, we're going to go into some curve stretching and levels adjustments in Photoshop, which is a very, what I would say, beginner-friendly, software. I certainly was able to use it. Finally, we'll go to Lightroom, and that's just another software that helps you do some touch-ups in terms of the light, and again, adjustments and things of that nature. So the important thing is really showcasing what's possible with the best data that you can possibly get in light polluted skies. So we'll see you guys in a little bit. Okay guys, we're going to go ahead and get started here with the pre-process editing. As I talked about earlier, I use AstroPixelProcessor, and that's what we're going to be talking about at the first part of this pre-process editing workflow. If you've got Deep Sky Stacker, which is a free program, you can certainly do your stacking prior to this and just go ahead and skip ahead to the Photoshop and Lightroom post-process editing for sort of the tips and tricks there. But if you're interested in hearing more about AstroPixelProcessor, go ahead and follow along here. I'll try to take you step by step and sort of show you my workflow with this particular program. I'm not advocating for it. It is a paid program, so if you're interested, I'll drop a link in the description for where you can, purchase this either as a renter's license with an annual fee or a one-time purchase. So let's go ahead and dive right in. To open up this program, just go ahead and double click on it. You've got to download it to your computer. There are instructions online. If you want to get the free version, you can do that. But once you get it going, you can see here there's a directory that's requested. So I would go ahead and select where your image files are. In my case, it's under a folder called Imaging. So you open that, and before you do anything with tab number 1, I just want to point out a couple of things. So here at the top, you can see here I've got my hard disk device and how much memory I've got. So it's important that you look at that. It tells me how many how many cores I have and how many threads I'm using. So I've got an 8-core CPU. It's an Intel 9700K, and I'm using 7 threads right now. I could bump this up to 8 threads. And this is a multi-core based program, so if you had more cores, you could go ahead and crank this up to 12, 16, how far down the rabbit hole you can go. So I'm gonna go ahead and put it to 8 cores. You can see that there's a bar here for RAM and RAM usage, as well as the operating system usage. So just some memory banks here to keep you up to date on what your computer's doing. And then there's a series of tabs, and we're going to go through these one by one. So let's start with the first tab, raw fit files. This is where you're going to select the kind of pattern that is most appropriate to your camera. If you're using a one-shot color, I'd go ahead and select RGGB. And there's a little description pretty much over every option. If you just hover, you can see here it's listed out, what's supported under each one of those options. So it's nice, just to be able to hover over any option in the program and identify what option's best for you throughout the entirety of AstroPixelProcessor. Now for algorithm, there's a very long explanation here, but suffice to say that if you're doing regular sort of one-shot color, full integration, stacking, you're going to want to select Adaptive Airy Disk, which is the preset, and continue forward. I really don't mess with any other of the features here. You could force the program to look at a Bayer pattern matrix. You can also do some adjusting and white balance, but I really don't mess with any of that stuff at this stage. So I think that's pretty good for the first tab. For the second tab, you can see there's multi-channel filter processing, multi-session processing, auto-detect, masters, and integrations. This program does create master darks, master flats, master bias, which we'll talk about in a second. So it can auto-detect if you've been doing work in the past and you've already got a set of masters, it can auto-identify those. Now, in terms of enter deep sky object name, here we're going to go with, let's go ahead and do M16-M17 for the first sets of object we're going to be looking at. That's the Eagle, Nebula, and Omega. And then from there, we click on light, flat, dark. If you've got dark flats, great, and bias. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and I'll show you here. When I click on light, I'm going to go into my first day of shooting, which was August the 2nd, 2021. I'm going to double click on that, and you want to make sure you've got a nice file set up so it's very easy to fetch this data. You don't want to just lumped in one big folder. Try to separate out your light frames, your flats, your darks, and bias into separate folders so you can just go ahead and fetch them easily. So in this case, I had multiple objects shot that night, so we're going to go with M16, M17 first. So I'm going to double click on this light frame folder, and I've got lights here. And you can see here, with the ASIR Pro, I've got 2 types of files. I've got a fit file and I've got a thin JPEG. So for the purposes of integration with AstroPixelProcessor, and the same is true with a lot of other programs, Deep Sky Stacker, etc., you're going to want to go ahead and make sure that you select fits. So you can see here on the screen, I'm going to go ahead and click on that, and it'll show you, okay, there are 5 fit files. So we can go ahead and select all, Control A, or you can click them individually. You could also hold down Shift and scroll down, just a whole bunch of different things you can do there. And the file name, it's got all of them listed across, so that's good. Go ahead and hit open. And then you've got this screen here where you've got to choose, the channel. Now in this case, it is RGB, so I'm going to select that. But if you had narrowband filters, if you were doing a filter wheel, you could have your luminance layer, your red, your green, your blue, so on and so forth, all the way down. So I'm going to go ahead and click RGB and hit OK. And the next thing it's going to ask for is which day of the session or multi-session, is applicable here. So this is day 1 or session 1. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. You could also select only one session if you had only one session, but here I've got multiple. All right, and there we go. And we can see down here at the bottom, they're listed. It's got lights, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It gives you the session, which is really great. And then it's got all this other data to the right, which eventually will populate when we go into the stacking process. So This little bar can be dragged down. I kind of hold it right about there. Then we're going to go ahead and do the same thing with the flat frames, the dark frames, and the bias. So again, flat frames, if you've got it organized, you can just go back out, select your flats, hit fits, select one, Control A for everything, open. RGB, session 1, and there they are, and you can see flats right beneath the lights, session 1. And as you scroll down, you'll be able to see all of them. So I'm gonna go ahead and insert all these files in here for a second, and then we're gonna come right back and keep going with our workflow. Okay guys, we are back. We've got all of our frames uploaded here, so I'm going to go ahead and take you through a brief sort of how-to on what to do now that you've got all your frames in. You're going to want to go ahead and double-click your light frames, as I've got here. The first image is pulled up, and boy, it already looks really promising. In fact, if you go to the right-hand side of the screen, you can see it's already stretched. But this green cast, go ahead and just click that neutralize background button, and boom, there it is. It's just beautiful, and this is one frame, 1 5-minute sub. So really excited about that. Haven't even done any processing yet. It's quite amazing. On the right, you can see there's another stretch factor here. It's at 15%, but you could bump that up to 20%, 30%. I tend to leave it at 15, 2.5 base, just to see a little bit of that pop. Not really necessary, but the important thing is to go through and just go ahead and cycle through. You can click down on your control pad, and it's not really a blink, it's more like a wink type of review. I know PixInsight's got this really cool blink function that just goes really fast, but it's not too bad. 3-4 minutes, you go through, cycle, and see if you find anything that needs to be chucked, whether it's clouds, big old satellites, airplanes, whatever, your neighbor's dog, poking their head around where they shouldn't be. So in any case, at the end of the day, you can see I've got 80 light frames here. I've got my flats, my darks, my bias. Now, you may be saying that's a lot, and I guess it is for each one of these, but I believe in the tried and true method of getting those 3 different types of calibration frames in each and every night after imaging is done, as soon as possible. And then, because you're accumulating those over every night, it does tend to add up. So go ahead and make sure you've got, your light frames good to go. And then I would say let's go ahead and continue. So here we've got the calibration section, and the system has automatic setup already, so you could leave that if you're a beginner to APP. If you wanted to get more specific, you can read some of the instructions here. Very simply, the 2 main options are average, if you've got more than 20 frames, or median, which is looking sort of just at a center sort of reference frame, if you will, if you have less than, or fewer than 20 frames. So this is for calibration frames, it's not for lights, but even still, I'm going to go ahead and select automatic. The outlier rejection format here is adaptive rejection. That's a pretty standard outlier rejection format. I would leave it at that, and if you select automatic, it just grays it out. Same with the kappa low and kappa high values, where it's looking for bad pixels and other artifacts. I would leave it at 6 for low and 3 for high. Same thing for master dark flats, master darks, and master flats, so automatic all down, or in my case, mostly average if I'm shooting multiple images each night. In terms of bad pixel map, I go ahead and select enable instead of automatic. I want to make sure that there's a bad pixel map, and a bad pixel map basically creates this very grainy, gritty map, which at the end of the day, shows where the hot pixels are and other sort of pixel issues that can be used in the rejection. I'll show you guys in a little bit once we get through the initial registration and processing. For hot pixel kappa, I tend to leave it at 3.0, but for cold, I put it at 25%, and this is just based off recommendations from others who have tutorials on APP's website. I think it's preset at 10, a value of 10%, but I go ahead and notch it up to 25, and it's worked really well. So without getting into the technicalities, that's what I would recommend. Nothing for cosmetic correction is selected, and then all this other stuff down here I basically leave as is. I want masters for each one of those calibration frames so that I can use it in the future. And so that's pretty much it here. I'm not going to be aligning any channels. I'm not removing any light pollution or demosaicing anything. So at this point, let's go ahead and jump to the next two tabs, which don't have any changes, but I at least want to go through them. The first is analyzing stars. So just like Deep Sky Stack or any other stacking program, it's got to analyze those stars. So I go ahead and leave this at the automatic settings and at 500. And then for registration, once it does have the stars, it'll register the different frames. Again, I don't really change any of this data. So the next two tabs are a little bit more important. Again, in my case, for normalization, I don't make a lot of changes. So we finally get to integration, and this is the most important one. This is where you're going to be identifying what percentage of images you want to keep in your final stack. I tend to sort of hover between 90 to 94% because I do check my stack for artifacts, but you could go down and maybe for the purposes of this video, let's say maybe 93%. We'll drop the 6 fewest frames. It's slightly less than 10%. It's like 7% there. For integration method, you can select automatic. You could also select average, median, maximum. I tend to go with average. So, this is again looking at situations where you have more than 20 frames. The outlier rejections will run with that algorithm. In terms of weights and how they're doing the rejections, you can do it based on these different parameters, exposure, quality, signal to noise ratio, noise levels. I think quality is pretty universally accepted as a good place to start in terms of your weighted integration methodology. In terms of outlier rejection, local normalization, I do select adaptive rejection, which is the most comprehensive. We're looking at really everything under the sun here. Under adaptive rejection, you can see more advanced, in which sigma, Winsorized, clipping, median rejections, all of it is pulled together to give you the best possible chance to keep the best frames out of your entire stack of images. Kappa low I keep at 6.0, kappa high at 3.0. I don't have diffraction spikes. I'm not using a telescope that creates that kind of imagery. In my case, I'm using a refractor telescope, so no diffraction spikes here. Composition, I leave it as is. Local normalization correction. Now, this is a really important one. When you're starting out, if you've got the same optics and the same setup and you're not really adjusting the sensor, you're not changing out filters, it's the same setup, you're just taking it in, taking it out, you probably want to run with just a first degree of local normalization correction and one iteration or one round of doing that. Now, if you've got more going on, if you're at different sites, different lighting levels, you've maybe changed the filter, or adjusted the filter, and you're not in the same exact position with the sensor, local normalization correction, some of these other settings can help make sure that your data is stitched together neatly so you don't get any weird patterns or anything going on there. If you're doing mosaics, a lot of people are these days because, of course, Milky Way season drawing to a close, then local normalization is really, really helpful. But again, for the beginners, I would say first degree LNC, start with one iteration. If you find that you're still seeing some weird artifacts and things, pattern noise, you could increase that to 2 iterations, 3 iterations. You could increase the degree of local normalization. But just know, again, every time you go up in number or level, every time the stack is normalized, another iteration means it does it again. So you could be talking about extra hours of processing when it may not be necessary. So it just depends on your situation. If you're running the same rig like I am without changing anything, 1 degree and 1 iteration, more than enough. Multiband blending, again, this is another feature that they've come up with in terms of trying to make sure that the borders of integrations aren't so frayed. That's somewhat unavoidable, to be honest, especially if you're adjusting your sensor night after night. But in the interest of keeping as much of the total frame as possible intact, the multiband blending, this feature is pretty cool, and I think it's helpful. It's set at 5%. It's pretty low. I would say go ahead and have it enabled. Doesn't hurt. I don't mess with integration output maps, not necessary. Then we get down to the last element, which is really unique to your optics and your camera setup. That's drizzle integration and then final integration. So for drizzle integration. And not to get too technical here, and there's a lot of explanations online, drizzle is basically, you know, a process whereby the program and the algorithms are trying to drop, you know, droplets, drizzle, you know, so that you get a nice average look. So if you're undersampled, you may find, you know, that your stars look like, you know, sort of a fuzzy outer core with just a bright X or cross in the middle. You're not getting enough data, you're not getting enough detail. It's because you're undersampled. It has to do with, you know, the focal length and your camera sensor. And in fact, there's a wonderful website that I'm going to share here. It's called Astronomy Tools, and they've got a calculator here, which you can go to, CCD suitability calculator, and they've got this little you know, bar at the bottom. It's been featured on a lot of different channels. Chuck's Astrophotography. Chuck, you know, I first saw it on your channel, and it was a big help. I know Trevor, your channel too, and Astro Backyard. A number of guys got it. But you can pop in your telescope, your camera, your focal length, everything, and then it'll sort of pump out the resolution. Now, I'm going to go ahead and just put in my focal length. So 250 millimeters for the Red Cat, not including the APS-C sensor. Don't worry about that. Just what's your native focal length, and then the pixel size. So you got to go to your specifications for your camera sensor. In my case, the ASI 2600 is, I believe, a 3.76. So my resolution is 3.1 arc seconds per pixel. And as you can see here, you know, it's sort of on the undersampled side of the equation. We'd want to be somewhere here between 1 and 2, but in my case, I'm over 3. So I am undersampled, which means, in short, that I need to make sure that I am drizzling. Otherwise, again, when I get into these stars, and let's see if I can zoom in here to show you guys. Yeah, it's kind of pixelated. I mean, you can sort of see it here. So anyway, long and the short of it is, if you can go to the CCD suitability, you know, calculator and figure out, you know, where you are in terms of, you know, your sampling, undersampling, oversampling, you can make adjustments. But I'm going to go ahead and let you know what I'm doing here. So top hat kernel is the drizzle integration method. I'm not going to change that. And then droplet size. So according to AstroPixelProcessor, the smaller the drops, the sharper and noisier the image. In my case, anywhere between sort of 1 and 2 tends to work really well for me. Lately, I've been finding that droplet size of 2, which again is less sharp than I would normally want, actually works pretty well, especially with noise control. But I would say anywhere between 1 and 2. If you wanted to do a sweet spot, you could do 1.5. I'm going to go ahead and run with 2 here though. And then we get to integration, interpolation, drizzle, and Bayer X-Trans drizzle. So in the case of my sensor, because I've got a color camera, I'm going to go ahead and select Bayer X-Trans drizzle. And in terms of scale, again, there's a little pop-up here and it says larger than 1 increases resolution, less than 1 reduces resolution. So interesting, you know, on the droplet size, I selected a higher droplet size, which means it's kind of less sharp and but less noisy. But on the flip side, on scale, I also go up to 2. So here I'm getting an increase in resolution. So take it for what you will. Again, this is what I do. Different people have sort of different approaches. There's a lot of information on the forums on AstroPixelProcessor for what works. But I would just say, you know, you can run this process with different droplet sizes and different scales to sort of see what works best for you. But generally between 1 and 2 is sort of where a lot of folks will be with their integration. So once that's all done, you can go ahead and hit the integrate button. When we're done, we'll come back and talk about tools. So let's go ahead and hit this and move on. And there we go. We're off into the races. So this guy's going to run. We're going to come back and continue the conversation. And it'll take a while. You know, I've fed it nearly 500 frames, so I expect it to take a few hours, but we'll see. You know, I'll give you a readout on how long it took. In any case, we'll check back in a moment. Okay guys, we've done the stacking, the registration, everything is here. We've got the final integrated file, and in addition to that, I also have a host of other data sets. I've got master flats, that's the MF. master darks, master bias frames for each session, 1 through 4. And that's really helpful because in AstroPixelProcessor, if you wanted to go back and maybe recalibrate or adjust any of your stacking parameters, you can re-upload all of those light frames and then simply add in the master frames for each session to be able to do that, and you don't have to go through the process of sort of re-registering all of those calibration frames. So definitely saves you some time. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the Tools tab here in version 1.082. I think it's still tab 9, but in the new beta version it's Tools. So just be aware that it's the same thing. There are a couple of options here that we can run with. We can do batch cropping, we can correct vignetting, calibration of background, star colors. We can even do combining of RGB. If you've got, you know, the HA and O3, you can sort of mix and match to do the Hubble palette that I talked about earlier. Really, really amazing tool. But what we're going to do here is remove light pollution. This is the only thing I tend to do in my workflow in APP. Everything else I leave for Photoshop. So as this is loading, essentially what you got to do is you've got to select boxes here in the frame to give give AstroPixelProcessor a chance to figure out what is the gradients in this image. So you're looking for you're looking for regions that don't contain a lot of nebula, as well as a lot of stars, you know, to try and keep the the process of removing gradients as simple as possible. So selecting some dark areas, and I would just say, you know, general rule of thumb is not to go too crazy with this. Try to keep it to, you know, a minimum if possible. I'd say anywhere from, you know, 5 to 7 boxes is probably more than enough. And I'm just going to select a couple here to give myself a chance to do some good gradient removal. So I'm going to hit calculate, and it's going to work in the background. And if everything's okay, we should see green boxes for, you know, areas where the sky is relatively moderate in its gradients, yellow boxes for where there had to be some adjustments. But overall, you're looking not to have any red. If you've got some red boxes, you may want to go back and make some adjustments and recalculate. You could also hit, there's a button here that's called Remove Red, if that happens, but boy, look at that. I mean, that's insane. From the original image to this, there are a number of, you know, yellow boxes here, but that's okay. We can see the gradients at the bottom was originally a little better, at the top not so much, so that's why you see that yellow, but I am very happy with that. So what we're going to do is click OK and save. All right, and that's going to pull up a prompt. We're going to hit OK to go ahead and save that. In this case, you know, I had a previous file, so I'm just going to overwrite that. And then you're going to want to do one more save, batch save here, for transferring this from a FIT file to a TIFF file. So let's go ahead and select TIFF. Let's make sure we select 16 bits. That's really important. If you select 8 bits, you might clip the data, meaning you're getting rid of a lot of that nebulosity, and when you go into Photoshop, it's going to be difficult to adjust, even though you can change, you know, the settings there. sRGB version 4, go ahead and leave that, DPI 72, and click Save. It'll ask you where you want it saved. You go ahead and say yes, just confirming TIFF 16-bit, no profile linear data 72, hit OK. And while that's saving, I'm going to go ahead and pull up Photoshop